So let's get right into the program, to the first slide. So here's just a color, a plethora of colorful tomatoes. And how can anyone not just salivate at looking at this slide?
Well, hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me all right. My name is Aaliyah Teeters. I'm with the Green Spring Gardens Master Gardeners, and I'll be telling you a little bit about selecting tomatoes. So hopefully I'll hit a few of the points that you missed in the 101 so far too. So next slide. So when you're selecting a tomato that you want to grow, what the first thing you want to ask yourself is, what do you like and how do you like to eat them? So there are kind of three main categories of tomatoes you might grow. There's your cherry tomatoes, the small ones. There's the large eating tomatoes, and then there's sauce tomatoes. And the first two are very good for eating fresh and putting on sandwiches. They're nice and juicy. While your sauce tomatoes are a little less juicy, and they're great for sauces and great for preserving. And the one big thing you want to remember is that cherry tomatoes are not good for sauces. They have too much peel and too much seeds, and they make a bitter sauce. On the other hand, the sauce tomatoes you can eat, but they might not be as juicy and tasty as the rest. So, some things to think about. Next slide. So the next big thing to think about is, what kind of space do you have in your garden? Are you growing in pots? Do you have tons of space? Do you have just a small amount of space? And so there's a couple of different terms that will help you figure this out. I'm going to go right to the indeterminate and determinate. You can see on the right here, there's a very tall tomato, and that's an indeterminate tomato. And an indeterminate tomato is a vining tomato that will keep growing and growing and growing. So you'll get tomatoes from the first production date all the way until the tomato plant is killed by frost. So this one takes a little more care. You want to prune it a little bit. The one in this picture, you call that a single leader pruning. So you take off all the little sprouts going off to the sides, and it goes up just one vine. You can also do it, 2 or 3 vines, and it will be productive that way as well. But that's the best production for an indeterminate tomato. For on the left, you have a determinate tomato, and this kind of tomato tends to be short and squat. It might get like 3 or 4 feet tall and maybe 3 or 4 feet wide, and it doesn't require much pruning, just a little bit to keep the leaves off the ground. And the other big thing about determinate tomatoes is that all of the tomatoes come in more or less come in all at once. So this is great for sauces. So if they all ripen at the same time, and you can take them all and use them at the same time. So a couple other things to consider here. Days to maturity, that will let you know on my seed packet how long the days to maturity is how long from when you put the plant into the ground to when you get your first tomato. So some are early tomatoes, you might get them earlier or later. So that's something to consider, is when do you want your first tomatoes? And then the last thing here is dwarf tomatoes, which are bred to be a little smaller than your average tomato. You might want to think about that if you have an even smaller space. And then there's even compact and midget tomatoes, which are meant to grow in small pots, like you see in this other picture with all the little red tomatoes. Next slide. So the next thing to consider is, do you want to save your seeds? Hybrids are a tomato that is bred very recently between 2 different kinds of tomatoes. And so when they're cross-pollinated, this new genetics makes the seed, well, if you plant the seed from a hybrid tomato, you don't know if you'll get the same tomato that you ate. You might get characteristics from either parent, and you might get something you had no idea was there. On the other hand, heirlooms and pretty much everything else, which is the tomatoes that are bred for a while but not as long as heirlooms, will pretty much stay true to form. So pretty much if you save seeds from those tomatoes, you'll get the same thing. Next slide. So why might you want to use a hybrid tomato? Well, the big reason is they tend to have better disease resistance. And to see what kind of disease resistance they have, you can look on your tomato package, and you can see up here, this is a tomato, a Better Bush hybrid, and it says VFN after it. And you can take these letters and look at this key and see that the V is for verticillium wilt, the F is fusarium wilt, and the N is for nematodes. So this hybrid will be resistant to those three tomato diseases. And there's a whole slew of other things they can be resistant to if you have trouble with a particular disease. And I think that's it for my slides. Next slide. Yeah, so that's a quick overview of what you might want to consider when you're selecting tomatoes. So are there any questions so far? Let's see.
So Aaliyah, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I apologize, but my apparently my internet was a little unstable, and so I really apologize that I couldn't get through my section. My husband is also on a Zoom call, so I think this probably is most of the issue. So I wanted to ask one little question. I thought, you know, you mentioned all the different the indeterminate, the determinate, different varieties. So if somebody is living in so like I live outside of Reston, and a lot of my neighbors are having to grow their tomatoes on patios. So what do you suggest, I mean, as far as varieties and how they can do that? Because I think that a lot of people may not have the growing space that that we all desire. What would you suggest?
Sure. Well, the tomatoes are pretty resilient. So in fact, all those pictures were of my garden, and I grow everything in pots. So it's possible to grow any type of tomato in a pot. However, if you are short on space, if you've got a small patio, then you might want to consider the dwarf tomatoes. But the other thing to consider is trimming them up. I would probably, in a small space, not go for a regular determinate tomato, because that's going to be big, but it will be short. But the indeterminate tomatoes, you can prune to whatever shape you want to. So that might be a good choice as well. But yeah, if it's particularly small, I might look at the dwarf or smaller tomatoes.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat. Do you want to address some of those? Let's see what it's saying. Are compact variety, I'm sorry, are tomatoes that grow better than others? I guess she's saying, are there tomatoes that grow better than others in zone 7? I guess she's speaking of varieties.
Yes. So I'm fairly new to zone 7, so but I believe that, didn't you have a slide of those in your presentation?
I did.
Go back to that?
I did, but it's back in the beginning of the program. I think that if you just go on, I mean, there are certain tomatoes that almost anyone can grow, the celebrities, the early girls, most of the cherries, all the sweet 100s, things like that. I think any of those will grow very well. I mean, tomatoes grow from New England all the way down to the South. And I think it's just really about when you're planting them out is more important than the actual variety for here. And typically here, we don't plant our tomatoes out until after Mother's Day. Then we don't have to worry about any freezes. The nighttime temps are warm enough and the daytime temps are warm enough. There's another question that's talking about what's the optimum size of the pots? And I think always the bigger the better. You're going to need a pretty large pot.
Yeah.
I would think.
I've heard, sorry.
Go ahead, no, go ahead.
No, okay. Yeah, I've heard that you want at least a 10-gallon pot for tomatoes. They will grow smaller unless you have a very small variety. But I grow most of mine in 15-gallon pots, and absolutely they could use more space if they will use as much space as they have.
And then there is another question. What's the difference between a Roma and a San Marzano for sauces?
Yeah. And I think that might be, I think they're both good sauce tomatoes. I haven't had a lot of
I think they're basically the same. I've grown both, and the San Marzano to me is a lot more meatier. It really has very, very little seeds, where I think there are, you know, in some Romas, there's still a few seeds and there's still a little space where the seeds sit in that gelatinous part. If you really want a real meaty tomato, that San Marzano is really the best for me that I've grown. Although sometimes I find that they have, they are more tend to get sun scald than some of my other tomatoes, or I had that last year. Let's see what the other, if there are any other questions that you might be able to address. I don't know why it went to this other, let's see. Suggestions on how to protect your tomatoes from the squirrels. Apparently, this Terry said that the tomatoes were eaten by her squirrels last year.
That sounds like it might be partially addressed in the next presentation. Isn't that growing conditions?
Maybe so. Okay, well then let's wait for
that.
her and see. That's fine. Okay, so then we're gonna, thanks so much, Aaliyah, for your presentation. Sure. We're gonna move on to Allison, and she's gonna talk about planting basics, pollinators, and insects.
Hi everybody, I'm Allison Paget. I'm with the Fairfax County Master Gardeners, and I'll just quickly go over some tomato planting basics, and I will address the squirrel question. In fact, we'll just do that first since it already came up. This is a picture from my garden, and the reason I really focus on the smaller tomatoes, like the cherry tomatoes, the blueberry tomatoes, is because they, for some reason, are not that appealing to squirrels and chipmunks. And I've had a terrible time keeping the little critters out of the bigger tomatoes. You can certainly put netting over all of your larger tomatoes, which you kind of have to use yard staples to get it into the ground to make sure there's no gaps. But you really have to be pretty dedicated to making sure that there's no little holes for things to get in. So I got tired of fighting with the squirrels. I switched to the small tomatoes, and I really haven't had that much trouble since. So as far as how the tomato planting basics work, I sent you to just mention when. Typically it's a week or two after your last frost date. People always want to get those tomatoes in early, and I am the same. I would love to have them right now, but that's just not practical. It's not good for the plant, and you won't get as much production even if they do survive. So rule of thumb is a week or two after the last frost date, and if you're listening to this from Northern Virginia, that's going to put you around May 1st if you want to be super conservative on that. And like Cindy said, Mother's Day is a good time as well. And as far as where you plant them, we just talked about patios a little bit. I mean, basically you want a lot of sun. So 8 hours is, it doesn't have to be all at the same time. It could be morning and afternoon sun that adds up to 8 hours. But they need a lot of sun. I would say 6 to 8 hours. 6 would be on the minimum side. I have tried to grow them in some shadier spaces, and they've worked okay. They get a lot taller, I think, because they're reaching for the sun and maybe don't produce as much. But anyway, the more sun you can get, the better. Also, and this, I find this really challenging, is you want to plant them in a place where you haven't grown tomatoes, potatoes, eggplant, or tomatillos in the past 3 to 4 years. And the reason for that is if you keep planting the same plant over and over again, the same variety of vegetable in your garden, you're starting to build up disease. You're building up the pests that specifically attack that plant, and you'll have just more battles to fight as you go on. So it's really best to rotate your crops if you can. I know that's not always possible. If you're like me, you have a very small piece of sun and otherwise shady yard, but if you're growing in the ground, to the extent possible, rotate your crops through so that you're not building up that disease. And as far as how far apart to plant them, you're looking at about 18 inches to 3 feet for the indeterminate, the kind that make the big vines. Sometimes those things can get, 6 feet tall or taller. They can really spread out. So you want a little bit of space just to get some air circulation between them. If you have the bush types, you can put those closer together. And of course, if you have the smaller patio kind in pots, and that's not really an issue. Next slide, please. As far as how to plant them, tomatoes are a little bit interesting in that you can actually plant them deep. I mean, a lot of plants you want to plant where the top of the soil in your pot or your seedling is even with the ground. Not the case in tomatoes. They get really tall. They need a really good root system. You can actually plant them up to the very top 2 set of leaves. So sometimes if you have a pretty long seedling, that's kind of a pretty deep hole, and it seems kind of strange, but what really happens is there will be roots that grow out of that stem, and they will make the plant much more healthy and supported in the long run. So plant them as deep as you like. You only have to leave the top 2 sets of leaves out. You can actually plant them vertically like you expect, or you can plant them horizontally. Let's say you've got a long seedling, you don't really want to dig a 2-foot hole in your garden. You can actually lay it sideways with just the top part of the leaves sticking out of the ground. Same thing will happen. It will grow roots out of that stem, and you'll have a much stronger, healthier plant over the long growing season. I mean, these indeterminate things will grow until, like they said, the first freeze. So you're going to get some big plants if you've got them in the ground. As far as weed control, definitely want to have some mulch in there. You can use grass clippings, nothing that's been treated with any kind of herbicides. You can use a weed-free straw. You can use other kinds of mulch. You can even put compost and use that as kind of a mulch to suppress the weeds. That's just for convenience for you, so you don't have to weed as much, and the plants aren't going to be competing with weeds for nutrition and water. So the more weed-free that you can get it, the better. And honestly, just pulling weeds is probably the best way to get rid of the weeds in a vegetable garden. You don't have a lot of options as far as herbicides and things. Pollination, these are self-fertile plants. You only have to have one plant. It has male and female parts. It will fertilize itself. It can be helped along a little bit by wind and also by bees, and that never hurts. If you see a lot of bumblebees flying around your tomatoes, that's a really good thing. And also not just the big bumblebees, but the smaller carpenter bees, the native bees, all kinds of things can help. But if you don't have any bees in your garden, it's not a tragedy. They can fertilize themselves through wind. And if you really find you're having trouble, you don't think that your tomato plants are being fertilized, you're not getting tomatoes, you can actually do it by hand as well, but that's a whole different conversation. Regarding temperatures, they really like about a 65 to about an 80-degree temperature range during the day. Once you get over 90, it can really inhibit how many flowers you get and how well the fruit forms. And then if it gets over 100 for several days, then it pretty much shuts down. I'm from Texas originally, and we don't even try to grow tomatoes in July and August. You kind of give up and start again in the fall because those high temperatures will prevent it from growing the fruit, which of course is what you want. You want that pretty fruit. This tomato here in this picture, this is called a Galaxy. It's an heirloom variety. I really like it. It looks like space. Next slide, please. As far as how to fertilize your tomatoes, what kind of nutrition to provide, to start out, you can always work in compost, like a well-rotted manure or some kind of compost into the soil. That will help with all kinds of things, not only nutrients, but microorganisms, oxygenation. It will encourage worms, all kinds of reasons to work in compost into the soil. But before you do anything in terms of feeding, and this is just a general rule of thumb across all kinds of gardening, all kinds of, whether you're growing grass, vegetables, whatever, is to start with a soil test. You can pick up those at various places around the county, and that will tell you exactly what your soil needs. It may not need anything. It'll also tell you what your pH is. And it's really hard because you're flying blind if you don't start with a soil test. So I would suggest doing that before you get started with your plants this spring. Tomatoes like a pH of around 5.5 to 7, which, you know, around here, that's not too hard to achieve unless something strange has happened in you're a little bit out of an outlier in terms of your soil. So you're probably okay there, but definitely the soil test will tell you what your pH is. There's a little range in there, 6.5 to 7, which will inhibit some of the fungal infections that happen with tomatoes. Like I mentioned before, you need a compost. That's a great way to enrich the soil without changing the pH and things all that much. And then let's say your soil test tells you you need other stuff. You're low in phosphorus or low in potassium. Then you can add those as needed, and you can purchase fertilizers that just have high concentrations of whatever it is that you're missing. So I wouldn't recommend just randomly applying something that you pick up that says it's for gardens or tomatoes. It really is better to get a soil test so you know exactly what you need. The main reason you don't want to randomly apply fertilizers is if you give it a lot of nitrogen, which a lot of fertilizers are high in nitrogen, before your fruits have set, the plant goes crazy, growing all kinds of nice stems and leaves and nice and green stuff, but it won't flower and it won't make tomatoes. The flowering and the tomatoes are really a function of having enough phosphorus in the soil. So you don't want to fertilize heavily with nitrogen at the beginning because you could have some problems with your production. Certainly once the plants have produced their fruit and the fruit's starting to get bigger, the tomatoes are starting to grow, they're there, then you can follow up with a fertilizer that has nitrogen, and that will help, but just don't do that too early. And I think Anne just put in the chat, thank you for that, Anne, that soil tests are available at Fairfax County Libraries, Ace Hardware, various garden centers, and also the Virginia Cooperative Extension office in the Panino building in Fairfax. And that's something you just do at home when you mix some soil together. There's all the instructions there, and you send it off to Virginia Tech, and then they send back an email with your results. Next slide. As far as insects to watch for, I just put a long list here you can refer back to. And how you would treat these various things depends on a lot of things. One is how bad is the damage. If it's just a little bit of damage, you can just let it go. If it's decimating your plant, and then you can start to look for treatments. We use the pest management guide that Virginia Tech puts out. But as far as general things, most of these will respond to things like neem oil or insecticidal soaps. If it's a really bad and you need to use something that's not organic, there's pyrethrin-based pesticides and other things. But definitely you want to identify what the problem is first before you try to apply any treatments. And if you're having trouble, you can certainly reach out to the Fairfax County Master Gardeners, send pictures and things, and we can help you figure out what's going on and what the treatments would be. Next, please. And that's really it for my piece. Here's the resources that I used, but we will, I guess, stop and take questions. To address the question that came up in the chat, it was about a question from Jasmine. She says she started her tomatoes from seeds at the beginning of March. They're small, and I just saw tomatoes at Home Depot that are much bigger. Did I start them too late? And should I just go with big box store tomatoes this year? I would say absolutely not. You are in great shape if your tomatoes are 3 inches tall. You still have a good month before they need to go in the soil, a little bit longer. And honestly, if the plant has already put a lot of energy into producing flowers, like some of the ones in the big box stores, it's not going to put as much energy into producing the good root system that you need. You're better off with small plants that haven't flowered. So you are right on time, and don't panic and go buy anything that's bigger and blooming already.
There was a question about the size of the pots. For a 10-gallon pot, how many plants should you have?
Yes, and that Helengano size is for one plant. You can put multiple plants, but they won't grow as big, so that's for one plant.
There's another question about, one of the speakers asked about sun scald, and there was a question that was prompted about how do you stop how do you stop or prevent sun scald? Maybe one should say, what is sun scald, and then how do you prevent it?
So I'm still having some internet issues. Mine is still saying that it's unstable. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So sun scald is caused mostly because you don't have enough foliage. And so it's real important that you do have that you have fed your tomatoes, and that you have enough foliage. And I did have sun scald last year on my San Marzanos, and I never have had that before. If you feel like you're starting to have some sun scald, you can also take some shade fabric and put on top of your cage. That will help some, but it's mostly that you just don't have enough foliage around your tomatoes. So I would, and I think it just depends on the variety. I think some varieties have more a propensity for sun scald other than others. So that's what I did last year. I actually went and got some shade cloth and put on top of my San Marzanos, and it did help. But this can happen with pepper plants. It happens with other varieties of vegetables.
There's another question about the fertilizers. You mentioned that nitrogen at the wrong time is detrimental to the growth of tomatoes. Someone asks about calcium.
So you can add calcium. You can add calcium to your tomatoes, but it's really something that should be in your soil. You know, that's why sometimes you have blossom end rot because of the lack of calcium. It's better to use the compost and the composted manure to kind of build your soil structure before you start planting your tomatoes, I feel. Now, maybe Allison or Aaliyah may have other suggestions for that.
I pretty much agree. The compost is the best way to build the soil. You can, especially if you're getting blossom end rot, or if you've tested your soil and you're low on calcium, then that's a good reason to add calcium.
And you should be able to buy that from, you know, Merrifield or any of the garden centers, some kind of calcium supplement. There was also a question in here about, they're talking, I think it's Paul, talking more about why the plants look so great at Home Depot and all that. And I think the reason why they are looking like, I think that Allison mentioned this, they have really pumped those plants probably with nitrogen. And so they are very bushy. They look, and they're huge for right now. If you put them out, I think you're kind of gambling with nature that we might have another cold snap or a frost that will kill them. So it's always better to start with a smaller plant, and then the root system will grow, you know, much vigorously than it would be from a box store plant that's planted too early. I wanted to read the rest of his. He has a lot of, it's quite a large question, a long question. Maybe I can answer this question on the in the chat box.
A related question to the calcium is Uma has asked about eggshells and crushing up eggshells and spreading them on her vegetable beds. You can do that, but it is still going to take a while for those eggshells to decompose and, you know, be part of the soil amendments. So, I mean, I do that. I do throw mine in, but I can't say that's going to be immediately able to be uptaked, you know, up into the plant. It's more of a long-term process.
If you're going to do that, the best bet is to put them in a blender and get a very fine powder out of them, and that will be the quickest uptake from your eggshells.
There's, in addition to the squirrel question earlier, Mark has a question about birds poking holes in ripe tomatoes, and how would you recommend protecting against bird damage?
I think either putting netting, like he has suggested in here, or you can use a plastic owl. Birds don't tend to be very deterred from my owl that I have. And if you have these tomatoes at your home, another thing you can do is there is a sprinkler system that's kind of like motion activated that some of my neighbors use actually for their deer, but I would think it would also just be a distracting thing for birds. There are other things you can hang little strips of foil that twist and things that scare birds. I've seen those in some of the catalogs. Really, I guess netting is probably the best choice, but that is kind of a pain that you have to take it off when you harvest. Does anybody else have any other suggestions about that?
I don't think that letting your cat outside is an official Virginia Tech recommendation, but it has worked pretty well for my garden. Not good for the wildlife, but great for the tomatoes. You can also pick them a little early, which you hate to do because you want the fully vine ripen. But if you get them before they're just perfectly ripe and put them on your windowsill for a day, sometimes you can beat the burrs to the punch.
Get the soil right, get your pH right. That's going to help you not have any blossom end rot. Because I feel like once it starts, that plant, there's just nothing you can really do for that plant at the time. I tend to just pull mine up. So, and then start over. So I think it's really being a little bit more cautious at the beginning and trying to get your soil right. That's my suggestion. I know there are blossom end rot sprays. Actually, my mother used to use these and she swore they work, but I've never bought them. I try to keep my soil in the best shape I can before I plant. And I find that I have less problems. I knock on wood, I've never had blossom end rot since I've lived here in Virginia the last 4 years. And I think that's mainly because I do use a lot of compost and a lot of composted manure. And I do rotate my crops. I know, like, I think, Allison, you said something about it's hard because sometimes, the only sunny spot in your yard is where you have to grow your tomatoes. So, and I couldn't imagine a year without growing, but you do take a chance every year with doing that. So I think it's more of you've got to prepare it before, because once you've got it, I don't think there's any way of really helping that particular plant. There's another question in here about companion plants. Does anyone want to speak to that, about maybe using basil or marigolds, to help deter some of the different insects that might be attacking your tomato plants?
Yeah, so basil and marigolds are excellent companion plants. They both, basil repels several tomato predators, insects, and is great to eat with your tomatoes. Marigolds are also good for repelling insects. There are several other plants. I think we had a presentation last week. If we've posted that, you may be able to see that video online about good companion plants. But another one for tomatoes is parsley. I believe parsley will attract insects, but you don't want to plant it right next to the tomatoes because then they'll go right to the tomatoes as well. Anybody else have other companions they'd suggest?
I like to grow borage next to my tomatoes. That seems to help repel some insects as well and also attract some good winds. Oh, that's another option. It's supposed to deter the tomato hornworm. I'm not sure if it does, but it looks pretty and it seems to work, so I like it.
Well, I do think that's another thing when you mentioned pretty. I do think that it is very attractive when you're growing your tomatoes with basil and marigolds. You've got all those colors and textures. It does really liven up, your garden and beautify your garden. So that's always another thing to think about. Oh, and someone's mentioned that green onions also help beetles away from the basil. Okay, that's a good idea.